some students will want to learn a programming language and then have the chatbot be a mentor, and it's writing some of the code, it's giving them feedback on the code, explaining things, and so on. Or they might want to just do as many, really fabulous projects as they can, and don't really want to learn so much about computer programming. They just want to focus on whatever it is they're trying to make, which of course could be something, a scientific simulation or a mathematical integration. It could still be very school-oriented.
Bonjour! Welcome to White Walls! My name is Mathieu Penaud. I am a product manager and learning experience designer, passionate about the role of design and technology in education and learning. In this podcast, I interview inspiring educators, researchers, designers, and innovators to discuss their journey and insights as they imagine and build the future of learning. If you enjoy the show, please share your favorite episode with fellow parents and educators, and make sure you don't miss our next guest by following White Walls on your favorite podcast platform, or even better, by subscribing to White Walls' free newsletter on Substack. Thank you for being part of the conversation, and now, your episode. Hi everyone! Today on White Walls, I'm honored to welcome Ken Kahn, a true pioneer in using technology to support creative learning. Ken has spent over 30 years as a researcher in programming languages, computer animation, and programming systems for children. After completing his doctoral thesis on creating computer animation from story descriptions, Ken taught at MIT, Stockholm University, and Uppsala University before joining Xerox Palo Alto Research Center as a research scientist. In 1992, Ken founded Animated Programs and developed ToonTalk, an award-winning game-like programming language for kids. He went on to become a senior researcher at Oxford, where he developed AI programming resources for students and held visiting positions at Yale-NUS, the National University of Singapore, and Yale-NUS. With his recent and fantastic book, The Learner's Apprentice, AI and the Amplification of Human Creativity, Ken demonstrates how generative AI can foster rich educational experiences and support creative learning, a topic we will discuss in depth in this episode. Ken, thank you so much for joining the conversation on White Walls. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Before we start, we'll do the usual rapid-fire questions. So, Ken, where did you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up in Chicago, had a good, happy childhood. And then I went to the University of Pennsylvania thinking I was going to be an economist. And last year of undergraduate, I took an AI course, and I had been doing AI little things as a hobby before that. So then when I was applying to graduate school, I applied both in economics and in AI. And I was very lucky to get into the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab, and that's where I went.
Nice. And where do you live now?
Yeah, so I'm in a little village about 10 miles from Oxford, England, and enjoying this. I've been in England for about 20 years now.
Do you miss the US sometimes, or do you travel back? Or
Yeah, I travel back now and then, but I miss it a little bit.
Great. And who was your favorite teacher?
I think it was my 8th year at elementary school is what it was called in that system. Mr. Benedict was the mathematics teacher who really introduced all sorts of new ideas and often would leave the curriculum and so on. And he was a very challenging teacher. As a matter of fact, I remember asking fellow students, and 3 or 4 of them thought, oh, he's great because, we're learning so many interesting things. And all the rest were so unhappy with him because he was too hard and pushing people too hard. But it worked out fine for me. But of course, in graduate school, it's a different kind of relationship, because your thesis advisor, your program committee, you meet with them frequently. You sometimes go out to dinner with them, and you become friends with them as well as them being sort of mentors. And they were great. Carl Hewitt was my thesis advisor, and then Marvin Minsky, who, the father of AI, and Seymour Papert, the originator of the Logo programming language and of Constructionism, were on my committee.
Great names, yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. Awesome. What is one thing that all kids should learn at school?
Uh, my bias is to, the most important thing to learn at school is learning to learn. And the constructionism theory that says that the best way of doing that is to do projects and then to reflect upon the projects, think about how you overcame problems, how you planned it, just generally thinking about your own thinking after doing projects that you're, especially projects that you're passionate about. Larger scale projects tend to be better. So,
Great. And what is one thing that all adults should learn at work?
oh, at work, um, that's a tough one. Every work experience that I've had has always been sort of an academic kind of context.
Hmm.
So in that context, it's, to be curious and creative and, you know, those kind of
Yeah.
qualities. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. What's been your favorite personal project with AI?
Oh, my favorite one, boy.
And I know you've done many, so.
Yes, yes. Um, I'm still partial to my PhD thesis, which was entitled "The Creation of Computer Animation from Story Descriptions," and it's very much like today's text to video kinds of systems, except that in those days everything had to be programmed rather than trained on data like today's deep learning neural nets. And
Mhm.
also, it was one thing I liked about it so much was that I felt like I really was feeling like a pioneer. Nobody else was working on AI and arts really. I mean, it was very difficult because the technology in late 70s, I was basically, I decided early on to make it so that the characters of the story should be as drawn as simply as possible because there's enough problems with getting the whole animation to get the movement and the relationships of the characters and emotional states. And Seymour Papert gave me this idea, which is that he said, don't try to do three very hard things at once. Just focus on one. And I decided to focus on the animation. So in my thesis, it was triangles and circles and squares that were representing the characters. But I think it still told the story well. And so,
Wow. And that was 1977, right?
yeah, I started working on 77. Finished the thesis in the beginning of 1979. Right.
Got it. Yeah. Very visionary for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. My last two questions. What is the latest thing you did? Usually, I would say for work or that you've maybe related to your book.
Yeah. Well, the thing I did 2 days ago, which I haven't,
Mhm.
I plan to soon write a little blog post about and show it to the world. It's, I've never done an AI project that had any kind of connection with current events or politics or anything. But, the ChatGPT has a deep research feature where you could ask it a question and then it clarifies exactly what you want. And it goes off for 10 minutes finding 50 different web sources and puts together a nice thing. And I asked it for 100 surprising events that the Trump administration had done, and came back with only 60, but that was fine because that was more than enough for what I wanted. And then I had this idea: it'd be interesting to try ask both ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini if they could make an app where it displays each one of these very nicely in the web page, and then the user's task is to select the 10 they think are the most important or the most interesting. And once they've selected the 10, then they, by dragging and dropping, could order them into the what they think is the most important and the least important of the 10. And then when it's finished, it puts on the clipboard your list of 10 that you can then share with your friends or whatever. So that was quite an interesting experience, and there were ChatGPT did quite well, except that its interface was much uglier than what Claude did. So it was an interesting little playful experiment and a different kind of experiment. I often try to do as much variety of little projects like this, and this was a pretty much a 1 day project.
Got it. And you did all of that using prompts only.
Yeah, just prompts. I didn't write any of the code or anything yet.
Wonderful. And the last question, what is the latest thing you did to relax?
To relax. I usually relax is to go for a walk in the woods, listening to a nice either audiobook or an interesting podcast or something.
Well, thank you for answering all these questions. And now we're going to get into the main part of the conversation. First, I'd like to know, like, how do you feel when you reflect on your whole journey, which is quite rich from where you started to where you are now?
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed is different than many of my friends and colleagues is that many of them kind of stuck with one topic and kept pursuing and improving it. And of course, there's closely related nearby things, but I feel like I've every few years jumped around. That as at MIT as a graduate student, I was very focused on this animation, generative AI, and AI programming languages and so on. But I was also even then spending about a third of my time with the logo group and interested in helping children program, especially when it came to having them put a little bit of AI into whatever programs they're making. But then when I went off to Sweden, I got interested in logic programming languages and focused on those. And then when I came to Xerox PARC, I was focusing on programming languages for AI, especially what were called multi-paradigm ones that had rules and objects and many different things all in one. And I became more and more interested in trying to make these languages concurrent so that there could be lots of little processes all interacting. I was very much inspired always by Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind that views intelligence and lots of little agents all interacting in various ways. Xerox PARC, I started thinking about something that Seymour Papert had said 10 years earlier, which is that the origins of the logo programming language were the idea of taking the best ideas in computer science and child engineering them so that these powerful ways of programming could be accessible to even very young children. So my thinking, early 1990s was, well, this work I'm doing on concurrent constraint logic programming, it sounds very esoteric, but I kept thinking, isn't there a way to make it accessible? And that led to my work on ToonTalk. It looked like a video game, but you could actually do serious programming, and you did programming by demonstration and then abstracting to make it a more general programs. And it was very much in the spirit of concurrent communications between agents and so on. And then the next big thing was when I came to Oxford. The project that I started was one in which trying to make agent-based modeling simulations where the individuals are interacting with each other, make that more accessible to Oxford students or postdocs or grad students, but making the ones that aren't expert programmers. So I built some tools to make it much easier to do that. But I also was teaching quite a lot of, and then the last project that I was doing at Oxford was to make it. I don't know how many people are familiar with the Snap programming language. It really should have been called Scratch Senior because it's very much like the Scratch programming language, except that it's got much more powerful, sophisticated computer science ideas added to it. So it's a superset, and it's quite easy in Snap to create new blocks in the JavaScript language. So I ended up added over 100 that were all giving students AI capabilities so they could make apps that would have speech recognition or computer vision to recognize objects. And then it led to even enabling students to create their own little neural net, train it and evaluate it, even, all within the browser and not having to have know as many of the details or complexity of other languages because it's the visual block-based language. So, and that was my direction for several years, and then I retired about 2 or 3 years ago, and that was when I started paying more and more attention to chatbots, and I guess I'll be talking about that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating journey for sure. And you just released recently this book, The Learner's Apprentice: AI and the Amplification of Human Creativity. And I'm curious what motivated you to write this book and how much it kind of tapped into that experience of yours.
I guess what first motivated me was both curiosity as to how much could these chatbots do, how much could they help you create apps, and then after a while, I expanded beyond apps into adventures and illustrated stories and structured conversations, many other things. But quite early on, because I had this 50-year interest in providing tools to students to make, even young students, to enable them to create interesting computer programs and ones even might include some AI. I thought the way to evaluate if these chatbots, might be an alternative to programming in, say, Snap or Scratch or something, was to role play students at different ages. So I would go up to type to the chatbot, I'm 12 years old and I'm interested in astronomy. What kind of web app can we make? And you go back and forth, and it suggests things and asks about your interest, and then you kind of tell it which ones things look exciting, and then half a day later you end up with a 3D model of the exoplanet system, TRAPPIST one, where you could click on any of the planets and get little information popping up. And there's so many examples like this where and I tried to explore the whole variety. So as I was always doing these, I always wanted to write up a few pages about it and just post them on LinkedIn and Facebook and so on. And then Gary Steger, one of the two people, Gary Steger along with Sylvia Martinez, runs this. They run these workshops that are very much in the constructionist framework, and they published about 16 books that are, including one that sells very well called Invent to Learn. That's kind of a constructionist book about maker movement and all the things you could do with 3D printers and microcontrollers and so on. So it seemed like working with them was an ideal. And the funny thing was when very first week when I was thinking about writing the book, I uploaded about a dozen of my blog posts to ChatGPT, and I said, what would be a good book proposal or something. Now, I wasn't really cheating because, I edited it and I added new things, and I, gave it feedback and said, no, that isn't good, change this and so on. And of course, the book proposal had an outline that evolved drastically over the 12 months it took to write the book. So, and I should maybe mention that for the most part, I think I could claim I wrote 99% of the book, or maybe 1 or 2% actually was Sylvia Martinez, the editor, made suggestions. But there was maybe 1% of the book that did come from chatbots. And two examples of that. One is where I would upload a chapter and say, please list any sentences you think, could be rewritten to be better. And it would usually come back with about a dozen sentences with suggested rewrites and a little rationale why do it. And I would say less than half were any good, or they might have taste or opinion, but it was still
Yeah.
the ones that were good. I copied and pasted their example. But the other thing I tried that was an interesting experiment with kind of co-writing was I asked 3 different chatbots, ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini, when I had a draft of the book, what would be a good preface for the book? And then I put together a preface where it was pretty much contributions equally from them and from myself. So I wrote a quarter of it, each one wrote a quarter or something. So then I had a draft that I pretty much liked, but then I actually took that draft and asked some chatbots, well, how can we improve this draft? So that's sort of a theme of the book, which is that, conversations and kind of creative ways of using chatbots is the way to go. And of course, the way not to go is to just ask for something complicated, get the result, and just be happy with it.
Yeah, no, it's funny. It makes me think of like one of the participants of the podcast. told me, "Oh, wow, with all the episodes you have so much content. You should write a book about it." And so, I mean, that seems like a big task. So I did go on a Notebook LM from Google, and I just uploaded the transcripts
Oh, right.
and say what's the common thread and some common threads among the different participants, and if I were to write a book, how would you structure it? And I was very impressed by how it created some chapters. There was a progression, it made a lot of sense. There was all the
Yeah.
some quotes, and it was very interesting to. I would help start.
Yeah. That reminds me too, which is that, when I first was doing these experiments about, can you write a book proposal? What would be a good outline for the book? What would be a preface? That was, I guess, 15 months ago. And they've gotten a lot better since. I mean, they're very impressive back then, but every few months you notice, a real improvement in both their ability to write code and to understand you better and to write better.
Actually, it makes me wonder, when you think about your book, how relevant do you think it's gonna be in like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years?
Yes, yes. So I think the general idea that there's so many different kinds of examples for students of all different abilities and age levels and interests, and giving enough examples to get across that how much is possible, and that you just have to jump in and ask often very simple start and then incrementally improve that. I think that's going to survive. There's one chapter that's already kind of obsolete, which is, for both apps and for illustrated stories, you want to generate images and you want to have the images fit appropriately. And there's a whole chapter saying, there's 3 or 4 shortcomings to the text to image generators, that here's some tricks to kind of mostly work around it. So one is that if you have multiple illustrations, the characters look very different each time. There's no consistency. And of course, if you wanted to have text, it would often misspell things and garble some of the words. And if you wanted to say, ask for, there was one point in one of the stories, just there should be 6 pebbles on the ground in a 2x3 configuration, and it just wouldn't do it. It wouldn't do it. It wouldn't do it. Probably more examples of some of the shortcomings. And then, about 2 weeks ago or something, OpenAI released a completely new technology for text to image generation that's completely integrated with the large language model itself. It's because the old way it worked was that was GPT would come up with a paragraph or two prompt and send it off to this other program, DALL-E, to get the image and then bring the image back. And so that was worked well enough, but the new one is just so much better at deal with consistency with number. And it for games, if you're making a game, you want an image that has a transparent background so that you can have the unicorn or the tree or whatever, not have its own background when you're combining. And that was just so difficult because the chatbot thought it was making it transparent when it was just confused about it. And now you could do it. So there's that kind of progress that's happened just in the last month that makes, 1 out of 27 chapters kind of obsolete. But I think much of it'll hold up. And maybe I should do a second edition 2 years from now.
You touched on something I really enjoyed when reading the book, which is that you illustrate with a lot of examples, and I think that makes it very easy to follow through the book. And I want to ask you a few questions based on something that Simo Papert often said about the importance of having low floors and high ceilings for
Oh, right.
creating like learning experiences, meaning like easy way to step into the experience and possibly to go to things that are much more complex and evolved. To which Mitch Resnick from the MIT Media Lab added White Walls,
Right.
which gave the name to the podcast. So everything's
Yeah.
connected. So I had a low floor, high ceiling, and wide walls questions for you about the book. So the low floor question is, what is an easy entry point for someone who would like to start experimenting with generative AI tools?
Right, right. So there's multiple different answers depending on whether we're talking about somebody who wants to create apps of some kind, and that is maybe the majority of the book. But there is, a good portion about other things. But let me talk about apps at first. So there's only one kind of magic word that you need to get started, which is if you say I want a web app to do X, or you say I want an HTML file to do X. There's several ways of wording it, but if you just say I want a program to do X, these chatbots could easily just make it in Python, and then if you're a beginner with low floor, you're going to have this obstacle of, well, how do I run the Python? How do I install things? How do I get new libraries installed? And it's just only reasonable to use Python if you're a pretty knowledgeable advanced user. But if you ask for a web app, and this wasn't as smooth 3 or 4 months ago, but now the top three, ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini, all, when you ask for a web app, they not only write the code, but then they split the tab, and on the right half, they'll display a preview or a running version of the app, so that you don't have to do copy and paste and figure out what files and open things. It's just so much easier. So it really is very low floor to get started. The first example in the book is one where I said, I want a web app that will generate random nonsense words. And it knew how to, make a little data structure with 20 different syllables and how to randomly pick the syllables and put them together into a funny sounding word. And then, the very next thing I said was, well, you can make the app speak the words. And one of the great things about, but this is starting to get towards the high ceiling part, which is that the chatbots, because they've been trained on millions and millions of open source programs, and they've also read all the documentation about every library and every API and stuff, and they've seen so many examples that, like in this case, instantly knew how to use the browser's speech synthesis API and generate the right code. And then when you click the button, you not only got the nonsense words, but you heard it being pronounced. And then you could go from there. You could say, okay, I want a slider that will control how many syllables, or I want it to generate fictional dictionary definitions, or just the possibilities are very large. The low floor is because you could just get started so easily if you use the magic word web app or something.
Yeah.
And web apps are just, web pages, HTML pages that have some interactivity because they have some JavaScript embedded in them.
Amazing. So even children can
Yes,
do it.
yes. Yeah. So, I did this experiment a month ago with my granddaughter who was just turning 4. Well, I did the typing and I asked her, well, what should we ask the computer? What kind of game do you want it to make? And this is kind of a 4-year-old mentality. She said, oh, I want the game to have spiders and butterflies. And the idea of the game is that you have to make the spider go to the spider toilet and the butterfly go to the butterfly toilet. And it just right away made it. And, we tried to asked for some improvements to make the interface easier for her to play with it. And it was even funny that the chatbot came up with this idea of putting green or yellow or red dots next to the images of the spider and the butterfly, and explained that had to do with how urgently the insect had to go to the toilet. So if it was red, you had to quickly get it to the toilet, but you got more points or something.
Oh, wow, that's hilarious.
Well, and one thing I should say too about low floor is that, and this wasn't true, when I started writing the book, which is that the the voice interfaces have gotten so good so that you could just start talking to it instead of having to type, a few sentences. You could just ask for things. And if you're very young or have other reasons you're not very good at reading, it could just speak the reply. So I've done a few experiments. There's a few in the book where you create an app totally by just talking to either the mobile app or in the case of ChatGPT, it works in the web version as well.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm curious, which tool did you use for the spider story and for the random words?
Yeah, there's a whole section of the book about how do you put graphics into a game or something. And the easiest thing is that if there's emojis that are roughly right, then you could even, sometimes it'll on its own decide to use an emoji for the butterfly or the spider. And if it didn't, you could always ask it, to try with that. The next easy thing is where it tries to draw it using the browser's what's called Canvas, where it writes a little program to draw it, and that is very general and very easy to integrate with a game, but it's kind of limited. And then the alternative, which isn't quite as low a floor, is to ask it for images. And again, you could ask for an image with a transparent background. But then you have this problem of, okay, you've got this file, the image file. How do you have the app refer to it? And the book talks about 3 or 4 different ways of doing that. But right now, none of them are quite as low a floor as I would like. I mean, if you could host the image anywhere so that there's a URL, you could easily integrate the URL for the image into your app. And if you're comfortable with file operations, you can make a little folder. The chatbot has even a download button. So you download the HTML into the folder, you put the images and maybe also sound effects or music, other things in that folder. And then you just tell the chatbot, I have a butterfly.png file in the folder, and it writes the appropriate code to use it. So the more sophisticated things you're trying to do, the floor has to be a little bit higher.
Yeah, and so that actually leads me to the high ceiling question. Like, how complex can you go? And especially if you're self-taught, right? If you're learning on your
Right.
own and trying to kind of get more and more ambitious with your projects, like how complex can it become?
Yeah, so very complex. I mean, I think that it used to be when I was first doing this, that after you got an app that was 200 or 300 lines of code, it would start to get a little confused about what was there, and you ask for an improvement, and sometimes it would add an improvement, but then disable a feature that it had added, 15 minutes earlier, and you had a ceiling that was still, 200 or 300 lines of code. You could still do pretty interesting things, but in the last few months, I've seen it generate 1,000 lines of code without, difficulty. And the most ambitious app that I talk about in the book, I call it, well, actually the name even, I asked ChatGPT, what should I call this thing after I made it? And the name, it gave me 10 suggestions, and I liked Emoji Adventures or something. And this is also a favorite with my 4-year-old granddaughter. So the idea of this app is that with the mouse or your finger, you could put down hundreds of emojis. Each one's kind of a random one, though it also has a feature where you click on the microphone, and then you could ask for a smiley face or a horse or whatever, and then it'll be using that emoji. And that relies on some AI, actually. That first off, it told me where I could get a table of descriptions of 2,000 emojis. And then when I said, I don't want the user to have to say the exact words in the description, it knew how to load something called the universal sentence encoder, and and try to find which of the 2000 is the closest to whatever the user just said. So that was the very first kind of feature. But then I added a feature called Chase, where every emoji randomly picks another emoji and tries to chase them, and everybody's all moving around like crazy. And when they catch them, that the other emoji disappears, and then you chase somebody else. And then I added a black hole that has gravity, and the emojis fall into the black hole and even get into orbits around it sometimes. And though there was, you could say bigger or smaller to make the emojis bigger or smaller. You could say faster or slower to make them move faster or slower. But then I said, do you have ideas for more features? And it came up with two that I was quite happy with. One was to have the emojis dance to music. And that was something that I've done, 50 plus years of programming, but I've never written any programs that analyze an audio signal and try to pick out the beat and then try to match that to, the animation and so on. But its first attempt was really poor, but it didn't take more than a few back and forths to make something that would have the emojis kind of move back and forth to the beat, and whether the beat was a song that we added to the app or one that was picking up on the microphone, didn't matter. It could still. This took me about 5 days, but it was, a 1,000-line program, and I didn't have to write any of the code, and I didn't have to have that much expertise to do this. And this was a year ago, so probably now it'd be 2 or 3 days because they've gotten that much better. And I know what the other feature. It was another one that the chatbot suggested, which was that on command they all move into some configuration. And I suggested, well, how about the idea that if the user says spell cat, that a third of the emojis go to a C, and a third go to the A, and a third form an A or a C or T. And it knew how to generate the table of where the positions would be, for the emojis to make these letters. And so that's an example of a high ceiling. But let me give you a very different one that's much more science school-oriented one.
And then I will call this one your answer to the white walls part of the questions, and like talking about diversity in the outputs.
So many different things. Okay, this one is maybe high ceiling because it was. So I was curious about seasonal influenza. I think I got curious because I was in Singapore and they still talked about seasonal influenza, but that's sort of strange because it's so tropical. The seasons aren't really that different, right? So I tried, finding out more about why there is these seasonal effects, and there's a lot of different theories, but some of them have to do with the change in the weather. If it's bad weather or cold weather, people spend more time inside, and then they'll more likely to spread the flu. So I said to ChatGPT, I was interested in exploring this question. How could I create an app that would, given the previous weeks of weather data, predict whether the influenza cases would be above or below normal or just average in the following time? And it first off said, oh, well, we have to, get the data, and suggested, the CDC for the influenza cases and the National Oceanic and Atmosphere, whatever it's called, NOAA or something, has all the weather data. And then I said, well, but, one of them is by day, and one of them is by week, and one of them is by city, and one of them is by state. And it gave all sorts of suggestions about how we could massage the data to make, a spreadsheet that combines them and, does the right averaging and conversions and so on. So then we had the data, and then I said, well, what kind of machine learning model? And it instantly suggested LSTMs, long short-term memory models. It's kind of a strange name, which is also what I would have thought. It's the one that's appropriate for kind of sequence prediction. So then we tried it, and it didn't work very well. And, I said, well, how can we make it predict better? And it said, here's 8 suggestions. And I said, well, let's try the one making the model kind of bigger and so on. And we kept trying things and it kept improving a little bit, but it wasn't a very successful project. So I was writing up the blog post about this, mostly failed attempt. And I thought, oh, I should include a figure that shows the data, little influenza cases over time and so on. And I asked the ChatGPT for it and gave me the graph. And I looked at the graph, and in 2020, the influenza cases tripled and then stayed more than twice what they had been for the previous decade. And I had a guess, but I asked ChatGPT, why would that be? And it said, well, maybe it's because during COVID, people were unsure whether they had influenza or COVID, so they would go to a clinic and get tested. So that would increase the number of recorded flu cases, because in previous years, most people didn't bother to go to the clinic if they had the flu.
Yeah.
They just stayed home for a few days. And so then I said to ChatGPT, well, let's do it all over again, but cut off the last 4 years of data. And it worked really well. It was very good at predicting whether the following weeks would have above average or below average
Wow.
cases. So that was a nice, real project with, data science, machine learning, all that.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
I had already done things like this, so I knew how I could have programmed it myself. But I was, again, role playing in this case, a sort of a fairly advanced high school student that, might know a little bit about, it's a good idea to break data into training data and test data, little things like this, but none of the details that they would need to know to really build
Yeah,
a network and train it and stuff.
absolutely. And actually, it brings me to schools and how teachers could use that in their classroom. What can students learn, and how could that be embedded into the school system today? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's a tough one, because it's clear to me that students doing these sort of large scale projects can not only learn so much more and also have a real sense of accomplishment, and also in the process of interacting with the chatbot, they have to kind of improve their communication skills, their critical thinking, to kind of give important feedback. And in most cases, they're the designer, have to be exercise their creative express their creativity, all those things. And if they're aimed at something that's a scientific or mathematical topic, when their project is like I mentioned, the simulating a 3D solar system, or modeling an ecosystem or something, that what they produce is itself of educational value, that it's, but I think the greater educational value is the whole process of creating it and designing it and working with it and understanding it in much more greater detail than if you were just handed a simulator and told experiment with it or something. So it's clear to me that if schools or teachers, were oriented around students doing large scale projects. I mean, when I was a student way back in the 60s, it was very popular to do science fair projects and then when I was in Oxford, I often hosted high school students that were doing really ambitious summer projects, and I would be kind of their mentor, and then they would present it at a well-known science lab, and it was pretty impressive what they could do in 5 or 6 weeks in the summer. But I understand that most schools aren't really set up to focus on that, though of course there's still after school clubs and other ways in which some of these ideas could be part of the children's life, even if it isn't the part of the standard curriculum or something. And of course there are parts of the world, and there's experimental schools that really do push project-based learning.
And do you think that would potentially create like a strong divide between those who know how to use AI and those who don't? Do you think that's a critical skill to acquire?
That's a good question. It doesn't have to, but of course, if the school is heavily constraining the way teachers could use chatbots in the classroom, then that could happen. But I guess I should say too that as much as I believe that big ambitious student um, design projects are the ideal, there's a lot of good stuff with 15, 20-minute little tiny projects, and that could easily fit into uh, school schedules and so on.
Mm.
And in the process, you still learn a lot about effective way of interacting with generative AI programs. And you could do many small ones in a variety of the wide walls is comes out of
Yeah,
the fact that these chatbots know, the whole internet, so they could help you do almost anything.
yeah. And I'm also curious about the possibility to link what you're working on, these projects that you're doing on the computer, with hands-on projects. 'Cause that's something I'm very passionate about. Is hands-on creative learning, and who's you mentioned Sylvia Martinez and Gary Steiger, who wrote Invent to Learn, which is about the maker movement, and
Right.
especially in
Yes.
the classroom. And so I'm wondering, how do you connect the use of AI for learning, as you describe it, and that importance of hands-on experiences? I'm sure you believe in as well.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. So first off, I keep meaning to try to do some kind of small scale little uh, robotic projects, because one thing that I did experiment with is the fact that you make a web app that could not only run on your computer, but it can run on your phone. And the difference with running on your phone is that it can make use of all the sensors on the phone, the GPS and the uh, acceleration sensors and the compass and of course the microphone and camera, and then you could, and it has Bluetooth and all these other things, so you could make a little uh, robot or interactive artifact, maker, movement, craft kinds of things, and then have the phone be both the perceptor and the reasoner, that it's seeing and hearing what's going on or sensing things. And it's also using AI to decide, that if you tell the robot, move towards the red ball, it could look around and recognize which is the red ball and turn and head towards it or something. So there's, I think, a lot of possibilities. And I did do a few experiments with, like with a microbit, which is a very tiny, tiny little computer, and asking, could you make it have a little game where if you tilt the microbit, a pixel sort of rolls until it gets to a target, and you have to tilt the microbit, left and right and up and down to get the pixel to move to the target. Or something. So it was able to generate the code, give me very clear instructions of how to take that code and put it into the microbit. So I think for a lot of the maker movement kinds of projects, uh, it could be adding a lot of supporting a lot of the software as well. And especially if the phone's in there, or you have a microcontroller that has Wi-Fi, then it could be talking to a big AI model somewhere and getting um, it to process the images or the sounds or the decide what to do.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, it opens again like so many possibilities. Right? It really feels like it's creating such a large landscape on which we can just play, like a huge sandbox. That's very exciting. And actually, do you look at the generative AI as a similar revolution for creative learning as compared to the use of computers at the beginning, especially when you were working with Simo Peppert, and what describes in his book Mindstorms, and how that use of computer by children could really foster their creative learning. Do you see that as a similar revolution in the learning space?
Yeah, very much so. And Seymour Papert was, saying from early on that, the student should be in control of the computer. And the way to control computers up until a few years ago was to write computer programs. And, again, he focused on making that as accessible as possible to children, even very young ones. Um, so now it's even easier to kind of take control of the computer by just having a conversation. But there is this remaining question, which is Seymour Papert was not only trying to empower the children to do really fantastic projects by controlling the computer, but the idea was that they'd be picking up what he called powerful ideas, which I think is actually a superset of what people today call computational thinking. So you're getting new ways to think about describing processes and how they interact and data structures and control structures and all that. And that's all readily available when you're having a conversation with a chatbot, but it's also easy to ignore some of that if you're really focused on how quickly could I create something that I'm imagining. If you're focused on creating and letting the chatbot take care of the details, I think you're still doing a lot of high level design. There's a lot of high level computational thinking going on, but it's taking care of all the details, and that may or may not be a big deal. And my view right now is that we don't have to decide that. Some students will want to learn a programming language and then have the chatbot be a mentor and an aid, and they writing some of the code, it's writing some of the code, it's giving them feedback on the code, explaining things, and so on. Or they might want to just do as many, really fabulous projects as they can, and don't really want to learn so much about computer programming. They just want to focus on the whatever it is they're trying to make, which of course could be something, a scientific simulation or a mathematical exploration. It could still be very school oriented.
Mm.
And one thing I experimented with that I think has some potential, but I haven't tried it with real kids. I have tried a lot of other things with real kids, but the idea that you tell the chatbot that you're interacting with students that don't want to learn all the fine details of a programming language, but they still want to understand how these programs that they're co-creating work. So you should hide the real code, but display what's called pseudocode, which is the kind of code that programmers often show to other programmers because it's the most readable. It's not tied to any particular programming language. But it's not a very good way to write programs. But the chatbot's doing the writing, so here you have the code be as readable as possible, and it can be it doesn't. It's not tied to any programming language, but it could be whatever language of that student. It could be English or French or Hindi or whatever. So I think that's a nice middle ground between ignoring all the programming language and computational concepts and focusing on creating impressive things and spending a lot of time with all the details, learning the languages and the libraries and the dealing with every error message and so on. That could really slow you down. I mean, you're learning some things that are useful, but and I guess I should say another thing about that, which is Seymour Papert often talked about how debugging is actually a great learning experience because you're trying to come up with hypotheses about why it's not working and investigate, and then do experiments by changing it, see if it fixes things. And some of that is still there with the chatbot, and now you have actually a colleague or an apprentice that's helping you do the debugging. And again, you're doing it at a higher level than the way it was a few years ago.
Yeah. So you can either decide that what you want to learn is the programming part, and so then you can, if you want to dig into it, or you can pass
Mm-hmm.
through that and focus on those outcomes that maybe is different, something else you want to learn about, but it gives you those
Right.
those
Right.
tools to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I have a last question, which is a question I ask everybody on this podcast. If you could design your school around one thing, what would it be and why?
A school around one thing, I think, would be a school that supports students that want to do really large-scale, ambitious projects, and that the way I would imagine that working is that the student should propose the projects, but they should also feel like they could do mid-course corrections, or if something isn't working out, propose a new project, and that they be assessed not just on the wonderful thing they might create, but they have to also describe the whole process of creating it and reflect on that process, so that its product and process both becomes how they're assessed. And I think that would be ideal. I mean, obviously, on top of that, to be supported by the teachers and your peers and so on adds to that whole story. I often talk about projects as if they're an individual project, but there's no reason, small teams of students can't work together, either, bouncing ideas around and interacting with the chatbot as, 2 or 3 students and a chatbot conversing, or for big projects, splitting it up where one of them focuses on the gameplay, another one on the artwork, another one on the music, and then they combine their results. There's many ways in which they could be working as teams and collaborating.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ken, for this amazing conversation.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. It was
Yeah.
very good questions.
Thank you. Where can people find more about your work and you?
Right. I mean, the easiest thing I tried, if you just search for Ken Kahn, KenKahn, it seems I'm the first 7 or 8 hits on Google. And if you look for me on Facebook or on LinkedIn, there's links to my homepage and to all the posts that I've posted in the last couple of years, and of course links to the book. But the book again is available on Amazon. The Learner's Apprentice: The Amplification of Human Creativity, which is really the focus of what I've been talking about.
Yeah, and I must say it's almost like an open source book, in the sense that you also have a website, I think, where you can find all the conversations, the detailed conversations you've had with the chatbots for all the projects that you mentioned in the book.
Yeah, no, that's an important point, that the book doesn't want to have huge, long conversations that sometimes occurred. So they're abridged, they're summarized, but that there's always links to the full conversation and to the app or apps that was created, or the stories or conversations that were created. So the online appendix is a great way if anybody wants to get into any of the details of anything that's in the book.
It's awesome. Yeah, so you can find it everywhere, and I also put the link as usual in the description of the episode. So thank you so much, Ken, and have a wonderful evening for you, because you're in the UK and I'm starting my day.
Well, thank you.